Hi, everyone. Nice to see people in person. The last time we did this, the attendance was mostly online. It was COVID. So nice to see people in the room. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Melissa Murphy. As Allison said, I am an adjunct at Tepper. I started in teaching some marketing communication courses and branding courses. Over my almost 10 years, it has now expanded to new product roles, innovation work, as well as the Corporate Startup Lab, which, as has been said, is about bringing entrepreneurial innovation habits and the spirit into large corporations who don't always have the same processes, the same philosophy when it comes to launching new products and innovation, especially when it's further outside their comfort zone for it. So that's what we specialize in. One of my absolute favorite things I do is for the Corporate Startup Lab is the capstone course, and working with clients and students to come up with solutions and then trying to bring those to life to inside the company. So I'm happy to be here today. Before my Tepper life, I also own my own consulting firm where I do a lot of executive training, new CEO, first 100 days, crisis work, crisis training. But my experience is actually mostly in the CPG industry. So I worked for Starkist, I worked for Del Monte, I worked for Heinz. Before that, I worked on the agency side of it. So I feel like I've been pitching most of my career, but it's really those 10 or so years in the corporate setting where I really learned the most about how to pitch innovation to the C-suite and pitch anything to the C-suite for that matter with it. So that's sort of my background. I'm happy to connect offline a little bit if anyone wants to talk afterwards or has specific questions, but I'm just going to walk you through some tips and some tools and ask you a few questions about pitching innovation. So before we start, I'm going to tell a little story, see if this feels familiar to anybody. You've got your dream job at your dream company, and you've been asked to pitch innovation to the executive team, newest product that you're working on, huge honor, a lot of energy around it, a lot of excitement. You and your team do a ton of work on the presentation, late into the hours, editing slides after slides after slides. You feel prepared, you get there, you start to get a little bit nervous, but take a deep breath, start your slides. You're about 3 or 4 slides into it, and out of nowhere, the CFO asks a question that you're not prepared for. Obviously, every executive in the room has their own agenda, and most aren't very patient, so they're going to jump in and ask a question. So that CFO asks a question. You noticeably look a little flustered. Maybe your face is getting a little red. Maybe you're scrambling through your papers looking for the answer. Before you know it, the CEO then starts to chime in as well, answering the CFO's question. Then they start having a side conversation that completely derails your presentation and your meeting. And so you're sort of left up in the front, standing there while they're talking. You've lost control of the meeting. It's gone on to another topic. And it doesn't really see a lot of room for recovery. I'm not making that scenario up. I've seen it happen a bunch of times. And I've also had it happen personally to me where I thought I was all buttoned up and I was prepared, and questions 5-10 minutes into the presentation threw it sideways for that. What I'd like to tell everyone today before we get started is don't be surprised when that happens, because it's gonna happen. Members of the C-suite are notorious for having time limitations. They want to get to the heart of the matter. They are very impatient. So you have to expect them to want to jump in. They're not going to let you present 30 slides to them and sit there quietly. That's never, ever going to happen. So the best thing you can do is sort of prepare for that and think about in advance of, okay, where do I want to stop and ask for questions? Where do I want to get information and sort of work through that? But bottom line, we should never be surprised by it. And we should be prepared to either pivot our conversation or redirect it. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well today. Anyone been in that situation? Got a few people. It could be pitching your capstone to your client. It could also honestly be pitching VC firms for funding. It could also be, if you're in a corporate setting and you're a member of the financial team, it could be earnings preparation. One of the things I've learned throughout most of my career particularly doing earnings calls and dealing with publicly held companies, is that frankly, it all came down to the questions. The script is lovely, that's nice, but it really didn't even make that much of a difference. It was the Q&A session, how that was handled, how that went, how prepared were they? That's where we saw a difference in that. So I'm going to talk about it in terms of a corporate setting. Please know anything we're talking about can be applied to pitching for funding, like I said, financial reporting. There's lots of different ways that this can apply, but for now we're gonna stay focused on that. Whoops, there we go. Okay, so what I like to say at the beginning and the end of the presentation is don't let the Q&A session be the death of your otherwise great presentation. We put so much time and effort into the presentation, and frankly, 9 times out of 10, not enough into the Q&A in preparation for it. So that's what we're going to focus on today and talk a little bit more about that. So some common challenges that we see when pitching innovation work, in particular in a corporate setting. A lot of times you'll see it maybe a senior manager, director level, going into pitch to a room of people that they may or may not know or have an existing relationship with, that represent different functional areas across the company. It could be operations, it could be supply chain, it can be distribution, it can be marketing. There's normally a pretty diverse cross-functional team in the room that's sort of sitting back a little bit and probably looking at your presentation, waiting to ask some questions, waiting to engage, waiting to address how what you're talking about affects their world for it. It's even more important in the corporate setting, because if you are an entrepreneur and you're pitching, say, VCs for funding for it, if it doesn't work, you move to the next one. In the corporate setting, that doesn't happen. You've got one executive team, you have one CEO, you have one CFO, so you either get it right or you fail, and there's really not a place to move on to from that. So we definitely hear that a lot from corporate entrepreneurs or intrapreneurs, that of being unprepared for the questions and how that portion of the presentation really went sideways. Even for the folks that felt pretty prepared, there were still questions coming out of left field from different functional areas that really challenged them about it. So let's talk a little bit about, get into how we think about managing diverse audiences. A couple more challenges before we do that are corporate entrepreneurs definitely have to defend their ideas early. They're going to be in presentations where you don't have all the answers. You don't have all the information, and you're working sort of off of a hypothesis for that. So in the corporate setting, we're really taught how to defend our ideas early, because people are going to question them. They're going to challenge them. They're going to wonder how it's affect their job. Where does it fit? How much is it going to cost? All happen. So we've got to be prepared when we're pitching really early on innovation, how we think about that and think about the questions that we'll get with that. Like I said, there's also a lower tolerance for error, because you don't get a redo with the corporate executive team. If you're lucky, you're pitching to them and it goes well and you get to come back. But if you really fumble that presentation, you will quickly be labeled not as qualified, or someone who isn't nervous, or someone that's not prepared for the meeting. So you need to be able to recognize that and be prepared for it. And different from other settings too, I think from the corporate entrepreneurs, you really do need a broader depth of information and learning from all the different functional areas. So we'll talk about that in a sec. So one of the tools of the Corporate Startup Lab is, it's called Pitching Innovation to the C-Suite. This is something that we use with clients. We use it in the capstone courses and a lot of different things. And it's not a magic bullet to be preparing for the Q&A session, but it certainly helps you prepare for it and feel comfortable with what you're going to expect, as well as how you might answer some of those questions and what that looks like. So here's a sample of overall how it looks. I'm happy to share copies of this. We have some laminated versions, we have paper versions, we have editable versions of it, but this is something that we use a lot. So this is sort of looking at it from a whole setting. And what we hope that can do, and I'm going to break it down and show you each section in the startup canvas, but in a pitching C-suite innovation canvas. But what it can help you do is sort of be prepared for questions. It can help you track your work. It can serve as a great place to keep track of conversations you've had with people in different functional areas. And at the end of the day, what I hope that it can help you do is not only present better, but also give you tips and ideas on how to build better alignment cross-functionally, because anyone doing innovation work in a corporate setting will tell you the biggest challenges come in that area of cross-functional alignment. How do I get everybody on board? How do I get everyone on the same page? How do I get us working together towards those goals? So we'll talk about that. So we break it down by key audiences, and this is just like the tip of the iceberg in terms of questions for it. But we're going to look at each of them. So for the CEO hat, we have questions like, does your idea fit with the long-term direction of the company? Does it help cannibalize existing markets or new ones? Does it make the company a better company? Does the idea make sense on the roadmap, or is it a one-off? What do the huge successes and failures look like within the company? How is the world different? And for whom is this idea achieving maximum potential? So one of the key things about pitching to the CEO is that you need to have perspective. That's what they want from you. They don't want necessarily the data. They want to know how to think about the data. How are you thinking about it? How are you framing it? And where does it fit within this bigger universe? Because they're never focused on one product or one business unit. They're looking at an entire universe. So you've got to be thinking about not just here's my product and why it's great and why they should buy into it, but where does it fit into our corporate ecosystem? And that's where some of the challenge comes in with that. What I'll say is these questions are a great starting place. If we have time at the end, maybe we'll brainstorm some other questions for some different CEOs, but these are just sort of a place to start. And the reason I think the tool can be super useful to everybody is the meetings change, the people sometimes change, the questions don't change. So the answers may, but the questions typically are the same. And the more that you learn about each functional area and sort of what their hot buttons are and what to expect, the better off you can be with that. Anyone in here pitch to a CEO? Anybody willing to put a hand up? Any questions that come to mind that you might get or that jump out as sort of hot button topics from a CEO perspective? Yeah, absolutely. They're looking for strategy. They're not into one product, no matter how cool it is, they're looking at the broader universe. So strategies are a really important part of that. So they want to understand that you can appreciate their worldview, that you appreciate the ecosystem you live in, and that you understand where your product, where this innovation is going to live and play, and what that execution may look like. You may not have all the answers. That's okay, but be prepared for the questions and know that the CEO more than anyone else is going to be at that like 30,000 foot level, looking at the big picture, and then before you dive into details on one product or one innovation for that. Typically, they're actually looking at a portfolio of innovation, not just one product. So again, it comes back to a larger ecosystem and the cross-functional learnings, applications, and operationalizing products with that. That's always going to be their hot button. Any other comments, questions about pitching to CEOs? Anybody want to add to that? All right. COO. So here's a couple of questions from the COO perspective. How might the idea integrate with existing processes, systems, workflow? How might it align or impact our culture? What core competencies are leveraged and what new competencies need to be developed? What resources will be required to develop the idea and later implement it? Will pursuing or implementing the idea create any spillover effects, positive or negative, in our operations for that? Again, the questions aren't about the product. The questions are about how does this fit in to the ecosystem? What does this look like? This is really, really typical, especially if you're dealing with a technology product that affects the way our employees live and work. So if it's something that we're bringing in to sort of operationalize how we organize, how we work together, one change has a ripple effect through the organization when you're making those types of changes. So you need to understand that's what they're thinking about is, well, if I change this one thing, if I add this one thing, if I remove this one thing, what's the ripple effect that that's going to cause? Again, much more interested in the big picture than they are on the specs on the product for that. So typical of a COO for sure. CTO, how do you know your idea is feasible? What technology will you need to buy, borrow, and or invent? How will your idea or operations fit within the existing products or systems? What expertise are you missing? On this one, I'd actually like to highlight operations fit within existing products and services. Again, you're going to see the patterns start to evoke here, that the questions that you're going to get hit with that you're not prepared for are less likely about your product and more about the organization and where things fit and the way they work together to make that happen. Nothing happens in a vacuum in corporate life. It all sort of rolls out to different audience, different departments. So you've got to be prepared for those types of questions. CMO hat, what's the target market? Hopefully the CMO has already been involved in the innovation in the product at this point. I would expect that. How does it overlap with existing markets? How will your customers find out about the product or service? What channels and communication? Where does your idea fit in the existing brands and reputation? What would failure mean to your existing products and brands, and how might you mitigate those? So one of the interesting things when you're pitching an executive team and you've got these different functional areas, you're going to have some champions in the room. If it's innovation, marketing's definitely probably going to be part of that. And behind that, it might be engineering, depending upon the type of product. It might be a technical team, but you've got people that are more in the loop than others. That can actually be a dangerous thing in a meeting, because if it appears that the one or two executives are fully behind it and in the loop and sort of drinking the Kool-Aid, the other executives, the hair on the neck will go up a little bit and be like, oh, I need to ask more questions or even harder questions because they're trying to sell me. It's always interesting when you're pitching, because yes, you are selling in some ways, but in that corporate setting, they're really looking for you to sort of be more like a consultant actually, and be neutral and fact-based and sharing information that way, so that you're sharing both the upside and the downside with it, that you're sharing ranges. I have a former CFO that I do a lot of work with, and his general rule on innovation work was, I'm going to double the cost and I'm going to cut your expected revenue in half. And if that still works, we can keep talking. So it's that basic rule that he would apply throughout. And he really did do it in meetings often. And he could derail the meeting better than anyone with that, and make you jump around. So sometimes you've got to learn to expect those types of questions with it. Marketing is typically going to be in the loop on it. So I would hope that there's somewhat of an advocate, but an important part nonetheless. And I think the question there is about, what if this fails? How does this affect the brands that I already have? What's the negative halo effect of a failure look like? How does it affect my beloved brand that consumers or end users are already using? So it's understanding both the positive sides, but also the negative, and showing that you're prepared for that. They don't want someone to give them all the positives. They want that sort of neutral assessment that looks at both wins and losses, and how does that affect us? What does that look like? How does that affect the ecosystem that we're in? Oh, legal. I tell you what, if you get in one of these presentations and you can win over legal and finance, you're in great shape. Legal, what are the relevant laws and regulatory frameworks? What's the intellectual property? Privacy, that's a big one. Environmental concerns, what contracts need to happen? What existing contracts will this impact? Can the customer safely interact with the product? If it's unclear, what's the government thinking about it? So my experience has always been, both with the financial team and the legal team, that I can either fight them or I can make them my best friends. I'm a firm believer of making them your best friends, because they can be your biggest enemy in the presentation for it. They're going to ask questions out of left field on purpose. They're going to ask all sorts of things. So we're going to talk at the end about ways to bring executives into the loop and how to work with them before you give your presentation to kind of set yourself up for success. But legal is definitely one of those to do that. I mean, that's their job. That's what they're paid to do, is poke and ask questions. And if they can poke at it and they see some weakness, they're going to keep doing it. I had a CEO that was constantly, the moment he sensed weakness from the presenters or the topic, he wouldn't let it go. He'd just keep drilling on the same topic over and over again. So you need to be confident. You need to be prepared. And in some ways, making these other cross-functional areas your friend and your partner, not the enemy in the presentation, which we'll get to in a second. CFO hat. So CFOs are notorious for looking at these presentations related to product in both short-term and long-term. So it is about the ecosystem, but they're looking at what is it going to cost me now? What resources is it using now? What is the process to build it? How long does that take? What resources and costs are required? And then long-term, when's it going to pay out? 9 times out of 10, if you're pitching early innovation, you don't have that answer yet on that. So we'll talk at the end about ways to answer questions when you don't have the answer yet. But typical of a CFO to ask those types of questions, again, understanding where it fits in both short-term and long-term. So you kind of need to be prepared broadly about the ecosystem, but also short-term and long-term, because you're bound to get questions for that. I'm kind of going through these quickly, but any questions so far on these? Everybody good? All right. Okay, so that's the tool. I'm going to go back to it for a second. That's the tool that we use. These are some of the questions. They're only a starting point. I promise you that if you invest in doing this once for a presentation and you come up with the questions that are appropriate for your organization for each of these, you don't have to reinvent it for the next presentation. It becomes a really useful tool and a habit that you have. Spending a little less time on the presentation and a little more time prepping for this type of information will definitely help sell innovation in the future for that. So I want to talk for a second about some tips in pitching innovation in general. So obviously the main point that I want to share today was about preparing for the Q&A session. But I'd be remiss if I didn't share some other insights on working with the C-suite team, the executive team, that level, and how to successfully present to them and what you can do before you walk in the room. Because to me, yeah, it should be in good shape by the time you walk in the room. So one of these things I like to call is pre-selling. I actually learned this very early in my career. I was on the agency side and we had a client that was made up, it was a consortium of 3 companies. These 3 companies hated each other. They would never agree to what the other one said. It was the most contentious industry organization I've ever worked with. They would, just out of spite, not approve something because somebody else approved it. So there were dynamics and politics galore, but it was really early in my career and I was kind of like, wow, I'm not used to this. So what I figured out very quickly with them was, the key with them was to pre-sell them, to meet with them ahead of the meeting. So the meeting before the meeting, to show them what I was going to present, get their buy-in, get their questions one-on-one. People are so much nicer one-on-one. When you get them in a group setting, yeah, that's their job to kind of go after it and pick at it. But if you meet with them one-on-one, they're far more likely to be candid, far more likely to have a conversation about it. And you can kind of start to learn about what is keeping them up at night and why your offering may help that or make it worse. So you can at least be prepared for it. So pre-selling and sharing draft decks with other teams is great. So what I tell people is the CFO is never going to preview your deck. He's never going to look at it and say, oh, let me sit down with you for 20 minutes and give you my thoughts on it. That's not realistic. But what is realistic is looking at the key members of each executive's team and understanding who they are so that you can then meet with them. Just because it's someone 3 levels below the CFO, let me tell you, they know what the CFO's agenda is. They know what the hot buttons are. They know what the questions are. And they're typically flattered that you're actually asking their opinion as opposed to, kind of dismissing them with it. So I always sort of made it a golden rule to meet with all the functional leaders I could. If I could have lunch with them, okay, I've had coffee with them, great. If I couldn't get them, I'd look at their team and find someone on their team and say, hey, let me show you what I'm presenting. Do you have any advice for me? Everybody likes to give advice. Everybody likes to be approached as an expert, even if they're sort of in mid-level management. So take advantage of other team members in the organization. Yes, pre-selling takes more time. Yes, creating questions and developing those answers takes more time. I can wholeheartedly tell you that by doing those things, the presentation will go much, much smoother for it. So think about pre-selling, think about floating ideas, think about getting reactions to them, and So you can figure out what those questions are going to be or understand different agendas. It's also great in a meeting when you're pitching to be able to say, oh, I met with so-and-so on the team. They asked a similar question. Here's what we talked about. So again, making those connections not as the executive team, but as individual functional areas and sort of getting to know them a little bit more, a little bit of background information. I used to always tell our brand managers, you will not get promoted unless finance supports the decision, because that was always their area of weakness for it. So understanding these cross-functional teams, how they work, it's important for day-to-day operations. It's probably 10 times more critical when you're doing innovation work to have that buy-in, to have that support, to have these teams working together. It's not something you can do in a vacuum with that. So one of the tips I say is pre-selling. Anybody ever done a version of pre-selling for a presentation before? How did it go? Did it help or what'd you learn?
Yeah, I mean, I was in a small corporate, so it was much easier to get access to the C-level. But yeah, like by the time the presentation, everybody knew what was being said. It was just the C-level. It wasn't in Pittsburgh that was being introduced. But even then, I had said back and forth with those stuff.
Did it make the meeting go smoother? Or no, not really.
No, it did. It did. I mean, there was one. It was. I was really trying to confront one particular one of C-suite. He wanted to go one direction. I thought it would either go the other direction. Ultimately, it didn't go that way, but
your way or the other way?
My way.
Okay, that's good. And again, it's helpful. You're not always going to win with something like this, but at least you can neutralize it and know what you're up against. Legal isn't typically super engaged, but they're there. And if they're there, they're going to speak up. So understanding what their issues are, just so you know, so you're not blindsided. It's hard enough to present to an executive team. It's hard enough to have a really diverse audience firing questions at you. So the more you can prepare for that, the better. But I find the pre-selling super helpful to do. And it takes more time. I know everyone's like, I don't have time. I got to work on the presentation. The more you spend on the Q&A, the more you pre-sell, the better the presentation's going to go. Hands down. I've never had that general rule of presentation backfire on me. Did you had your hand up? You said you did as well. Yeah. Yeah, people like to know you listened to them, you heard them. So to call that out in the presentation, to be able to say, oh, when we met, you raised this concern, we really appreciated that. Here's how we're solving for it. You're using the relationships to help you to build that alignment with it. That's the most important part. The biggest failures I've seen in my career are actually when someone has a presentation and honestly, they're treating it like it's like their first child and they're kind of holding it close to the vest and they're not sharing and they're being protective. They're the ones that get shot down in the meeting because you haven't built alignment to get you there. You had your hand up too?
Yeah. This is not just particular for corporate settings, but I feel pre-selling is also important. Like I do that when I'm going for competitions or applying for fellowships, just getting in touch with them, asking the right questions, seeing what is it that they're looking for. That's very important. That helped me quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it really does. It breaks people down a little bit. It makes it individual. You have a relationship there. That's great. And guess what? There's always going to be surprises to your meetings. Someone that wasn't invited shows up. They're the worst because they weren't invited. They're probably mad they weren't invited. And so they're going to make sure you hear them in the room and they're going to say something. We had that happen last year in a capstone setting where they had someone just kind of pop in for it, which is always dangerous, who hadn't seen any of the presentations, had never heard the team, didn't know what the objectives were. And she was tough. Her questions were good. I'll give you that, but she definitely rattled a few of the groups because it was like, who is this person? Where is she from? What's her background? What's her agenda? No idea who it was going to be. I'm a stickler for wanting to know everyone in the room, but you have to be realistic that there's going to be times where there's going to be surprise visitors that may be a friend, they might be a foe, and you kind of have to be ready for that. But making that the last option is good for that. But yeah, I think pre-selling in all sorts of things is a great way to do. I've done it for careers, I've done it for networking, I've done it for jobs, and I pretty much always do it for presentation. I came from departments within the company that were small. So my small team always had to sort of fight its battle with that. We had no choice. We didn't have the breadth that the other groups did or the number of people. So we had to build these alliances to be able to do it. But generally within corporate, that's what corporate's all about, is being able to work cross-functionally. Nothing stays within your nice little window. It doesn't, that's not a realistic expectation for it. So you got to be prepared for that. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I mean, this is, I think, really specific maybe to a product management goal. But, you know, one thing I found very helpful was when I got hired, using that new halo of being a new hire to really get in front of leadership and ask them, what are your objectives of the suite of products that I'm just got hired to manage?
I'll tell you what, being an intern or being a new hire is the perfect permission to talk to everyone anytime. A leader is going to respect that. Like it takes, I'll watch my language here. It takes some, I don't know what the right word for that is. Courage. It takes some courage. Yeah, that's it. It takes some courage to walk up to an executive that you don't know or that you haven't worked with and be like, hey, can I buy you a coffee? Or, hey, do you have 15 minutes? A little off topic, but absolutely use being a new person, intern or hire, to be able to ask questions, to meet with people. Again, generally people have egos and they're flattered when you ask them. Most people will do it. Some may not, and that's okay. Just roll with it. You tried. But definitely using that to your advantage to do that. It's a huge opportunity, and it's a huge way to be successful, particularly if you're an intern and you're trying to get a job. Again, if people not only on your team support you, but the broader organization actually know who you are and respect the work that you're doing or had any connection to you, that's going to help. That's human nature at that point. Any other comments on pre-selling, either a presentation or more broadly? Sure, go ahead.
Do you have any suggestions how to deal with people who may be impactful and feel threatened either by you personally or by your idea? And I know this is a tough question.
No, it absolutely is. I mean, I've worked with a lot of great people in my career. There's a few, if I never see them again, I'm okay with that. I didn't like working with them. I didn't like their style. Our styles of working were very different. I'm very collaborative, communicative, informal, and they're very like rigid, and it's just bad chemistry between us. My goal with that, or areas that just don't support what I do or what I believe in, is to neutralize. I'm not going to win them. So I got to recognize that fact. I'm not going to win them, but how can I neutralize them in the meeting so that they don't take what I'm doing and send it sideways? So even if I don't like them, I'm still going to pre-meet with them. I'm still going to ask their questions. I want to know what their agenda is. That's why I'm doing this. I want to find out what everyone's agenda is so I can prepare and position what I'm trying to sell, promote, move forward in the best way possible. But if there is someone that is either difficult to work with, challenging, just different style than you typically have, it's going to happen in the workplace. Try to neutralize it. Try to meet with folks one-on-one. That's the best way to do it. It's because in a group setting, they're going to have the hairs on their neck up and wanting to sort of, posture within the room. I have had times where I've kind of given them their chance to posture so that I can kind of get it out of the way, because I don't want them to derail it. You got to be careful with that because they're hard to control sometimes, but do the best to neutralize in advance, one-on-one. And if that doesn't work, just try and do things that keep it, again, neutral in the meeting setting. Does that help? Yeah, you're not going to win everybody over. Not everyone's going to like you. Not everyone's going to like your ideas. They're not going to like the way you work, your team, or your presentation style, and that's okay. It's work. That's why we all work together. But learning to neutralize it, learning to deal with it, learning to be open to it that's just part of career development. And I think taking it one-on-one is always going to be the best way to go, even if there is a problem. The worst that can happen is there's a personal problem that you and I have, and it somehow bubbles over into my pitch or my meeting. I don't want that to happen. So I want to do what I can to neutralize it. I want to give compliments where I can. I want to give credit where I can, and just think neutral. and don't let them get under your skin. Because the second your neck starts to get red and people can see it in your face, then, you know, you've just lost the audience when that happens with it. That's why you take a sip of water or tea or whatever it is and just sort of reset yourself for a second.
And it may depend on the role and relationship in the work strategy of the person, right? Because if that challenging person is a client, you can assign dedicated high-level person from your consulting company to address their questions before they ask, and if they ask, and give them special attention. But if that person is your supervisor, then that's much tougher.
Yeah, I've had that happen where the client was a very, very, very difficult client for everyone. And it took a lot of offline conversations with him to figure out what worked for him and frankly, who could work with him. And so we were able to make it work. He had to be part of the process. He had to be part of the solution to it, or it was never going to work, which we brought him in to do that. But it was finding someone who could take it and kind of let him, you know, I like to say that was the most emotionally abusive relationship I've ever been in, was with this client. But I could take it. I can let it roll off. It's fine. It's not, because it's not about me. It's rarely about you. So you kind of do that with it. So with a client, it's different. With a supervisor, that's just tough, because that makes me say, okay, something went wrong in the hiring process. Because this is getting sort of philosophical, but I always want to feel like I'm set up to succeed. And if that relationship with my supervisor is the problem, I'm not set up to succeed. I don't feel confident. They don't feel confident. Nobody's comfortable. It's awkward. And I want to change that. So I want to move somewhere else in the company or move to a different company for that. But most of the time that's happened, it's been someone on a cross-functional team who has a different workload, a different agenda, different priorities, and they just don't want one more thing to do. And I can't blame them for that, but my job is innovation. So I'm going to bring new products. I'm going to challenge our systems. I'm going to talk about how we expand. And hopefully work with them to find the best way to get the resources I need to deliver the product with it. Other questions? I know we're going a little bit off topic, but it's all communications related. So fire away.
Maybe building on what you said about neutralizing the enemies and kind of that intersection of pre-selling and the CXO, kind of the big personalities and the top questions that they ask. Here's a good comment on any tactics that have worked for you in terms of tactics towards making them look good. That's something that I've seen across like clients in sectors where, like, you know, particularly when you talk about COO, CFO, or just any chief sales officer with one actually, they're all jockeying to become the number twos, are all jockeying to become number one. Or move up and stuff. That's a great big comment on what your experience has been there and maybe some elements of that.
It's a balancing act, is what I'm going to say about that. You don't want to be the person that gives everyone else credit and you don't take enough for yourself. I want to be a team player. I want everyone to rise with me, but I want it to be clear that I'm in charge, though, of this product or this process. So it's a balancing act to do that part of it, for sure. I'm all for bringing people in early. I'm all for giving them credit. Any way I can get them engaged and sort of supporting my agenda, I'm definitely going to do that. As far as specific tactics, it really came down to it goes back to pre-selling. It goes back to having a meeting with them and understanding their agenda and their goals and what do they want. And then figuring out, okay, so now I've done a financial team member, a legal member, an ops member, and a marketing member. How do I take what I've just heard from them and whittle that down that it helps me with my presentation? It helps me sell what I'm trying to do. It helps me to move it forward with that. I don't think there's any magic tool for that. I think it's talking. And I think the bigger the challenge, the better to take it one-on-one and offline, because you don't want it to happen in the meeting. I see people, so if you're in the work environment and there are folks that want to avoid communication, they don't want to deal with the conflict, they don't want to address it, they don't want to engage in it, it ends up blowing up in a meeting. So I would much rather have that happen offline, even if it is contentious. Offline one-on-one is easier to deal with in a group setting where there's a meeting and there's teams and there's people that, you know, they're showboating. They're trying to show you up in your own meeting. So I can't change it. I can neutralize it. I can give credit where credit's due. Absolutely. You want to be gracious. You want to be humble, but you don't want to give it away either with that. I think you've got to be able to balance some of that because you want to be perceived as being in charge of your own stuff, but that you're able to work with others and bring everybody forward together. Is sort of the way I would approach that. Does that make sense? Do you agree with that?
Yeah.
Other questions? Go ahead.
You know, I was gonna add, when I made the transition to a corporate, because it was 5-person startup, so in which you wear one of the functional areas, you are that person. But what I found very interesting was that there were executives that were tough, and so they had personas from none of their team members who would just tell you they're terrible, this is how they are. And I think it's easy to rely on that information and make your decision and plan around that, but it's typically flawed. And they typically have a much different persona and behavior to their team members. And it's, if you can't meet with them, you should definitely prioritize meeting with the team members because they're going to give you a different perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Might be very tough externally, but they might be very different internally.
Yeah, so we had, and I'll tell a small story about it. We had a VP of operations who had been in the role probably 30 years. We weren't going to teach him anything new. He didn't want to learn anything. And he especially didn't like sales and marketing as a whole. You know, he'd look at you and be like, you're not going to be here 2 years from now. I'm not changing my whole way of working. And you're going to be jumping onto another brand, another project, another team for it. Very, very difficult to work with. Very difficult meetings for that reason. But took it offline with them. And, you know, again, at least I want to know what the questions are going to be fired at me for. And that he was one that you weren't going to win him over. That wasn't going to happen. It was never going to happen. But at least if I knew how to think about where he was coming from, that would help. If I would say that I worked with someone on his team, that would help because he wouldn't always give you the time of day because in his mind, you literally didn't deserve it. But if he knows you worked with his trusted colleagues, that helped. Sort of getting some of that goodwill by association. Can never undersell the ability to do that as well. All right, I only have one other slide. Let me jump to that and then we can open up some more questions for it. I want to just close the loop on the Q&A section and preparing for that and thinking that through, and then we can continue to have conversations as a group or in smaller discussions. But think about the questions, come up with them, write them down. I don't care if they're handwritten scribble. I don't care if they're in a template or a platform, but it's a continuous thing. It's not like, oh, I do this once and I'm done with it. Here's my running list of questions on these innovation initiatives I'm working on. I add to them on a regular basis because as we move down the pipeline of the product development, there's going to be different questions and different people will be enemies for it. So when you think about terms of developing a Q&A or using the pitching innovation to the C-suite document, you've got to think about it as a fluid document. It is not, we do it, we put it away, we're done with it. This is an ongoing tool that we use and prepare for all presentations for that. So if it's one person, keep the running list. If it's a team, have a central document where people can dump questions in. Hey, I grabbed lunch with so-and-so and they asked me this. Put it in there, make the whole team smarter. And that'll be a good thing to do. And it'll give different perspective to it. Even if you've got junior people or new hires on your team, you make them so much smarter by letting them see the questions and the answers, even if they're not even in the room for it. So prepare, think it through. Trust me, a little less time on a PowerPoint slide and a little more time on this will do wonders for the presentation. I know in past presentations, I've actually had other functional areas ask questions where I've met with them one-on-one. They asked a really good question. I'm like, hey, would you do that in the meeting in front of the large group so we can talk about it and have a conversation? So again, collaborate. Work with the people in the room, get them to help you, get them to ask questions. And if there's no questions, I've never, ever been in an executive meeting that didn't have questions, for the record. But if for some odd reason you're in an environment like this, or you're presenting to a large group of 300, 400 people, and there are no questions, what you'll typically say is, well, you know, I know we have no questions today, but typically what I hear is this. So I'm anticipating what you're thinking, even though you're not willing to sort of step forward and share it. Pointing that out in a meeting, wrapping up with, some questions we've considered as a team are this, or some questions that I know the ops team have raised are this. And do it yourself, set it up. Show that you've thought about it, you have the answers to it. If you do some pre-selling and some one-on-one, you're going to know what the big questions are. So if nobody asks them, hey, we got some questions about that from the team today. I want to share that with you. Or, we debated this topic. Executive teams want to know that you've vetted your idea really well. So they want to understand sort of, what did you say yes to? What did you say no to? What was your thought process? Because that's what strategy comes out of. So they really want to know that part of it. So it's okay to be like, hey, we were on the fence about this. We tried two different things, but based on this data, this insight, this research on the customer, we went this direction. We used to have a CEO that was notorious. To his face, would say he's the best product manager we've ever had, because he will ask really detailed questions, and he always thought he was the audience. So we always had constant conversations about bringing it back to, here's what we're doing, here's what we considered, but based on inputs from our end user, our customer, this is why we're going in this direction. So it's not you saying it, it's you're using the customer, the audience to make the point for you. I'm not selling the product. I'm creating a product that I know this audience cares a lot about. It addresses a problem that they have, and I know that they care enough to take action and actually buy my product. That's pretty powerful. So you're taking it off of you a little bit. That's also helpful to do, especially when you've got someone in the meeting that might be a little more contentious or might not be aligned with it. It's not you versus them. You are representing the customer or the end user when you're pitching innovation. So what would they say? What would they do? It's not about me, the individual. It's about that end user, that customer. That's always a good way to reframe the conversation as well and bring it back to that, because it's hard for anyone to argue with that piece of it. So having that up, having that slide in your appendix that you can pop up because someone's going to ask about it, is good. The CEO or members of the exec team are not going to listen to 15 slides on your target audience, their habits, their pain points, everything else, the journey. They either don't care or they think they already know it. Either way, they're not going to listen to all of that. I always have that information in my appendix of every presentation I give, because if it's going to be a tough question, I'm always going to go back to the customer end user. So I want to put them up on the screen. So again, I'm removing myself and I'm pulling it back to who's the consumer, who's the audience, because no one in the room besides marketing, maybe sales, can actually argue with that, because they're the ones who did the research, or the innovation team with it. Yeah.
I have a question actually very related to customers and users.
Mm-hmm.
When, who, and how should engage them when preparing?
Always, early, often, always is what I'll say to that. It should never be you selling something. It should be you selling something based on the feedback, based on the inputs for that. If I were an executive team level, I most certainly would have expected a lot of consumer insights to that. So I don't want to hear your theory on what you think the audience needs. I want to hear it from them. I want them to be able to verbalize it. I want you to be able to show me how they engage with it. So again, as we talk about pre-selling, that's definitely part of pre-selling. But I mean, if we're in early innovation work, and I'm going to step away from the communications aspect for a second and say I'm just doing innovation work for it. That's going to be the most critical part, is the customer inputs for it. I want those early. I want those often. And like the questions, that's a living, breathing process. I don't get consumer feedback and then put it on a shelf, or end user feedback or customer feedback. I don't get it and then put it on a shelf. I am constantly getting it, constantly getting feedback. And that's part of my process that I have for innovation work. It used to be that for certain product categories, whether we were in healthcare, some of the consumer product areas, where you do research once or twice a year. Well, that's the good part of social media, and the platforms that we have, use those to get continual feedback. Don't hold your breath and wait till the end. It's about continual feedback. So doing it early, doing it often, definitely is the best way to go for sure.
Are you talking about shadowing the customer or having a conversation with them or survey or all of the above?
It depends what the product and the product category is. Some are going to be a little more challenging to get and do. So if I've got a B2B tech product I'm doing, the way I approach getting customer inputs and feedback is going to be very different than if I had a consumer product for it. So I kind of have to know my marketplace and who the players are and how I interact with them. But those paths look very, very different. If anyone's interested, I actually have a really great, we talk a lot about personas and journey maps and what that looks like. And that's fantastic when we're talking a consumer facing product. When we're talking a B2B product, it looks very, very different. So if there's anyone in the room that's doing B2B, I'm happy to share it, but it was a Gartner slide on a B2B journey map that was incredibly insightful and shows not the 3, 4, 5 touch points, but the 15 touch points something has to do to get into that. So it depends on the category. When we're done, if you want to talk, if you have something specific in mind, I'm happy to drill down for that, but I would probably use all of those. If it's consumer facing, I'm going to do surveys. I'm going to do focus groups. I'm going to do online A/B testing with ideas, concepts, and also communication. Just about what we're talking about here. It's not just about what the product is, but there's 15 attributes I could sell. How do I pick the right one to sell? How do I prioritize them? How do I communicate those out? How do I test my messages? So just as we're kind of talking about a presentation, I do the same thing with my product and getting that input consistently in every step to be able to do that's really important. Other questions on that? I know we're close to the end, so why don't we wrap up? There's the pitching innovation to the C-suite. I am happy to chat afterwards if anyone has more questions or more specific questions. Happy to chat about it and talk more. Thanks for your time today. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate all the questions and interactions. It makes it a lot more fun for me to do this when I get some participation. So thank you. All right, bye.